What makes a man keep the key to a secret he was afraid to reveal even to his own son? Alexei Sokolov asked himself this question as he stood in the stuffy attic of his late father's house. Dusty rays of July sun filtered through the cloudy skylight, illuminating the mountains of old things, newspapers, and broken furniture in the semi-darkness. He had come here, to Verkhnekhamsk, to sort through this inheritance and sell the house. But at that moment, his blood ran cold. He realized he had found something more than just junk. In his hands was an old wooden box he had never seen before. Before we continue, let us know which city you are from. We are interested to know where our videos are being watched. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave your rating. This motivates us to make new and interesting videos. Well, let's get started. He opened it. Inside, on faded velvet, lay 3 items. A photograph of a young, smiling man who looked painfully like his father, an old diary in a cracked leather cover, and a map folded in 4. Alexei immediately recognized his grandfather, Ivan Sokolov. The cemetery guard had gone missing in the summer of 1988, long before Alexei was born. The family had long since come to terms with the idea that he had either run away or been the victim of an accident. But what Alexei saw next did not fit into any logical pattern. The map turned out to be a plan of the old city cemetery, but with notes made by an engineer. An old noble crypt was marked with a cross, and dotted lines with incomprehensible calculations led from it. Alexei opened the diary. The first pages were devoted to the work of a caretaker and some restoration notes. He knew that his grandfather, Ivan Petrovich, had worked as a restorer before the cemetery and was interested in history. But the last entries turned the diary into a thriller. Ivan wrote about a cavity under the tomb, a ventilation system through an old well, and gave some terrifying calculations. Canned stew, beef, 3,000 cans. Buckwheat, 200 k sugar, 100 kilos. Enough for at least 10 years. If only Alexei had known that this discovery would completely destroy his perception of reality and his own family in a few hours. The last entry, written in shaky handwriting on July 15, 1988, read, "They won't leave me alone. This is the only way out. I'm sorry, son." His heart pounded in his throat. 35 years. Exactly 35 years had passed since that date. Alexei, an architect and restorer by profession, suddenly saw a chilling logic in his grandfather's chaotic notes. This was not the ravings of a madman. This was a plan to escape, but not from the cemetery, but into its depths. Driven by a sudden, irrational impulse, he grabbed the box, ran out of the attic, and got into his car. He didn't know what he was looking for, but he felt that the answer to the question that had tormented his family for decades was waiting for him there, among the overgrown graves and crooked crosses. He had no idea that he was already being followed, and that his discovery had set in motion a mechanism that had been dormant for 35 years. The old cemetery greeted him with silence and the smell of rotten leaves. Tall pine trees cast long shadows, turning the sunny day into a gloomy evening. Alexei walked along the overgrown paths, checking his grandfather's map. There was the old church, there was the fallen oak tree, everything matched. He felt someone watching him, but when he turned around, he saw only branches swaying in the wind. It was silly, but the feeling of danger grew with every step. He approached the spot marked with a cross. Before him stood a massive black granite crypt, thickly overgrown with ivy. The family crypt of the Obolensky princes, according to the faded inscription. The door was locked with a rusty lock that looked like it hadn't been touched in 100 years. But Ivan's diary contained a clue. The third stone to the left of the entrance, second row from the bottom. Press until you hear a click. Alexei ran his hand skeptically over the cold, damp stones. He found the one he was looking for. The stone looked solid like all the others. His heart was pounding. It seemed crazy. He pressed down, nothing. He pressed harder with all his weight, and suddenly, with a quiet creak that made him jump back, the stone gave way and sank a couple of inches into the wall. At the same moment, somewhere to the side, behind the wall of ivy, there was a dull click. Alexei carefully pushed aside the thick tendrils of the plant and saw what he feared most, but at the same time had been waiting for. A narrow, dark passageway opened up in the wall of the crypt. The passageway smelled of icy cold and damp earth, decay, and something else. Something stagnant, uninhabited. Alexei turned on the flashlight on his phone. The beam of light revealed steep, worn steps leading deep down into the darkness. He took a step, then another. With each step down, the temperature dropped, and the sounds from the surface faded away, replaced by the hollow silence of the underground. He found himself in a small room that looked like an underground warehouse. And here, another shock awaited him. This was not just a dungeon. In the corner stood a homemade cot, next to it a table and a chair. On the shelves along the walls were rows of empty, rusty tin cans. Thousands of cans. But that wasn't the worst of it. In the far corner, the beam of the flashlight hit something that made Alexei freeze. There, on the cot, covered with some rags, lay a man, or what was left of him. Incredibly thin, with long gray hair and a beard, he looked like a mummy. Alexei was sure that he had found the remains of his grandfather, that this was the end of his search, the tragic conclusion to the story. He slowly approached, shining the light on the motionless figure. And at that moment, his world turned upside down. The old man's chest was barely moving. He was alive. Suddenly, the old man's eyelids fluttered and slowly opened. Two pale, almost colorless eyes, unaccustomed to light, stared at Alexei. Dry, cracked lips moved, and a hoarse whisper, like the rustling of dry leaves, escaped from his throat. He uttered one word that pierced Alexei like an icy needle. Dima? Dima. That was his father's name. Alexei recoiled, almost dropping the phone. His brain refused to accept what was happening. Before him stood his grandfather, Ivan Sokolov. After spending 35 years in darkness underground, he mistook his grandson for his son. The old man tried to sit up, but his emaciated body wouldn't obey him. He coughed, and the dry, raucous sound echoed through the crypt. Alexei, overcoming his initial shock, rushed to him. He realized that every second counted. His grandfather was on the verge of life and death. With trembling fingers, Alexei took out his phone. There was no signal. He realized that it was his fault for coming down here alone, unprepared. He had wasted precious minutes, but now he had to act. He ran upstairs to the surface, greedily gulping the warm summer air. The sky seemed impossibly bright after the underground darkness. He ran away from the crypt, and the phone screen finally showed the life-saving network bars. He dialed 112. "Ambulance," he gasped into the receiver. "Someone's hurt, badly. Old cemetery, the Obolensky crypt." Yes, in the crypt. He's alive. He's been there for 35 years. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Alexei realized how crazy his words sounded. But now was not the time for explanations. He had to save the only person who was a living witness to the secret that had destroyed his family. He did not yet know that his call had triggered another, far more terrible threat. That, in a luxurious office in the city center, a very influential man had already received a report of a strange call to an old cemetery. And that man, Peter Krotoff, realized that a ghost from his past, whom he had long believed dead, had returned, and he would do everything in his power to silence that ghost forever. An ambulance siren pierced the silence of the cemetery, its wail growing louder as it mingled with the crackling of branches under the wheels of the vehicle, trying to drive through the overgrown alley. A few minutes later, 2 paramedics with stretchers and suitcases were already running toward the crypt. Seeing Alexei, they stopped, but he just waved his hand desperately toward the dark opening in the wall. "There. He's there," he shouted. The paramedics, 2 experienced, worldly men, looked at each other. They had been called to attend to an unconscious man, but they had not expected to have to descend into a crypt. However, what they saw below caused even them, who were accustomed to everything, to freeze in shock. It was not a sight for the faint of heart. One of the medics crouched down next to the old man and placed his fingers on his neck. His pulse is weak, but it's there. His blood pressure is probably 0. He's severely dehydrated. "How long has he been here?" he asked his partner, without taking his eyes off even. Alexei, who was standing nearby, replied, 35 years old. At that moment, the paramedic looked up at him, and his expression said it all. This guy is either lying or he's lost his mind. But now was not the time for arguments. They carefully, as if it were a crystal vase, transferred Ivan's emaciated body onto a stretcher and began the painful climb upstairs. The police arrived after the ambulance. A young lieutenant looked suspiciously at the crypt, then at Alexei, then back at the crypt. The story sounded like delirium. And if it weren't for the living proof that was already being loaded into the ambulance, he would have called for a psychiatric team. The car with flashing lights sped away, taking the ghost from the past to a world he hadn't seen in 35 years. Alexei followed in his car, his phone ringing off the hook. The news had leaked out. It didn't matter if it was the ambulance dispatcher, the police officer at the scene, or someone else. What mattered was that the information bomb had exploded. By the time they arrived at the regional hospital, journalists were already crowding the entrance. Among them was a girl with a penetrating, tenacious gaze, who immediately stood out from the crowd. It was Anna Lebedeva, a reporter for the city's most popular online publication. She realized that this was not just another accident. It was a sensation that could change her career, and she wasn't going to let it slip away. At the same time, in a panoramic office on the top floor of the Verkhnekhamsk City Business Center, Peter Krotoff was looking at the screen of his smartphone. He had just received a screenshot from an internal police chat with a description of the incident. Krotoff, a respectable gray-haired businessman and patron of the arts, felt a chill run down his spine, one he hadn't felt in many years, even Sokolov. Alive. Impossible. He had personally checked that the guard had disappeared. He was sure that he had either frozen to death in the forest or been eaten by wolves. But he had survived. The only witness to how his empire had begun. A witness to murder. Krotoff pressed the selector button. "Victor, come to me, immediately." A minute later, his son entered the office, a 40-year-old man with a heavy jaw and emotionless eyes. Victor Krotoff, head of security in his father's empire. "We have a problem," said Krotoff Sr. curtly, without looking at his son. "Someone has resurfaced, From the past. He's in the regional hospital. He mustn't talk. Ever. Take care of this. Quietly and permanently. Victor nodded silently and left. For him, it wasn't a question of morality. Just another job. A difficult one, but doable. He was already thinking up a plan. The hospital was a crowded place, but even there were weak spots. The main thing was to act quickly, before the old man regained consciousness. In the intensive care unit, Ivan lay under an IV, entangled in monitor wires that beeped, showing the fragile rhythms of his life. Alexei sat next to him, never taking his eyes off him. The doctors said his condition was critical but stable. His body was clinging to life with incredible tenacity. In the evening, Ivan regained consciousness for the first time. His eyes focused on Alexei. "Dima," he whispered again. "No, Grandpa, I'm Alexei. I'm your grandson, Dima's son." Ivan's eyes widened. He was silent for several long minutes, and Alexei could see two eras trying to collide in his mind. He finally croaked, and his voice betrayed genuine fear, something Alexei did not expect from a man who had survived hell. "They'll find out. He'll find out. Krotov." Krotov. The surname hit Alexei like a bolt of lightning. Pyotr Krotov. The city's chief patron. His portraits hung everywhere. What connection could there be between him and the missing guard? "They'll come for me," Ivan continued to whisper, his breathing becoming ragged. "They'll come for you." At that moment, Alexei realized that what he feared most was beginning to happen. It wasn't the paranoia of an old man. It was a real threat. He stood up to call for a doctor, but at that moment, the door to the ward opened quietly. A man in a white coat and mask with a sanitary badge appeared in the doorway. He didn't look like the staff Alexei had seen before. Something in his movements, in the way he clutched the syringe in his hand, made everything inside Alexei shrink. "Scheduled injection," the man said hoarsely, approaching Ivan's IV, "vitamins." Alexei instinctively stepped forward, blocking his way. "I'll call the nurse," he said firmly. "She'll do it." For a moment, anger flashed in the orderly's eyes. He tried to push Alexei away, but Alexei clung to his arm with a death grip. A short, silent struggle ensued. The man in the gown was stronger, but Alexei was acting out of sheer desperation. He screamed. A nurse rushed into the ward, followed by the doctor on duty. Realizing that his plan had failed, the stranger broke free with a violent jerk, throwing Alexei aside and rushed down the corridor. He was still clutching the syringe in his hand. He only dropped it when he reached the stairs. When it was picked up, there was no liquid inside. It was empty, a lethal dose for a weakened body. The police arrived again. They listened to Alexei's story, but looked at him with obvious skepticism. An attempted murder? Of the influential businessman Krotov? It all sounded like the ravings of an overworked grandson who had too much on his plate. The cameras in the hallway were undergoing scheduled maintenance. The man in the robe disappeared without a trace. Alexei was left alone in the echoing hospital corridor. He had saved his grandfather once, but now he realized that this was only the beginning. The enemy was real, ruthless, and by all appearances, all-powerful. He had lost everything that was dear to his family 35 years ago, and now that same enemy had returned to finish what he had started. In despair, he leaned against the wall. What should he do? Who could he trust? And then he saw her. The journalist, Anna Lebedeva, was walking down the corridor toward him. She looked straight at him, and there was no pity or curiosity in her eyes. There was only business. "Alexei Sokolov?" she asked, extending her hand. I think we need to talk. And I think you understand that I'm the only person who will believe your crazy story. Alexei looked into the journalist's eyes. There was no sympathy there, but there was a sharp, scalpel-like interest. He was trapped, alone against an invisible and all-powerful enemy. The police didn't believe him. The doctors saw him as nothing more than a source of problems. Trusting this woman, who saw his tragedy as nothing more than a sensation, was madness. But he had no other choice. Okay. He nodded, the word coming with difficulty. But not here. Anna Lebedeva nodded understandingly. She could already see a couple of burly men in police uniforms heading down the corridor toward them. Time was against them. Follow me, she said curtly. We have 10 minutes before they decide to detain you for questioning. They left through a service exit that Anna knew from her profession. Her small, nimble car was parked in the backyard. Getting inside, Alexei felt trapped, but there was no other way out. He told her everything, about the attic, the box, his grandfather's diary. Anna listened silently, her fingers flying across the screen of her smartphone, quickly writing something down. She didn't interrupt or ask stupid questions. She processed the information like a predator tracking its prey. When Alexei finished, she was silent for a few seconds, staring straight ahead. Krotov, she said finally. Of course. In the late 80s, there were rumors that he didn't start out in the party, but in something much dirtier. But everyone who could have talked about it either disappeared or suddenly became rich and shut up. Your grandfather didn't keep quiet. He just disappeared. At that moment, Alexei's phone rang. It was an unfamiliar number. He answered. The voice on the other end was polite but steely. It was the investigator who had come to the hospital. But his tone had changed. Alexei Dmitrievich, he said, we have received a report. It says that you are illegally holding your incapacitated relative and preventing him from receiving help. You will need to come with us to the department. Alexei froze. Krotov's car started. They weren't just trying to intimidate him. They were trying to isolate him, cut him off from his grandfather, make him a criminal. He realized it was his fault. He had brought his grandfather to this city, brought him out into the light, and now the system, controlled by Krotov, was grinding them both down. We have to get him out of the hospital, Alexei said, his voice trembling. Right now. Otherwise, we'll never see him again. Anna looked at him, and for the first time, he saw something more than professional interest in her eyes. It was excitement, the excitement of a hunter who had picked up the trail of a large animal. It's almost impossible, she said. He's in intensive care. No one will let him go. And the whole hospital is already under Krotov's control. But Alexei wasn't listening anymore. He was thinking about his grandfather's words, about his fear. A man who had lived in hell underground for 35 years was not afraid of death. He was afraid of Krotov. And now that fear had been passed on to him. I won't leave him there, Alexei said firmly. And then Anna made a decision that would change her life forever. She ceased to be just a reporter. She took out her press card. Okay, she said. I have a plan. It's crazy, but it might work. Drive to the back of the hospital and wait at the service entrance to the kitchen. Don't get out of the car under any circumstances. You have 15 minutes. With that, she got out of the car and walked confidently toward the main entrance of the hospital, where police officers were already standing. Alexei watched her go, not understanding what she was hoping for. 10 minutes passed, which seemed like an eternity. Then another 5. He was about to jump out of the car when his phone vibrated. A message from Anna. Come out now. At that moment, The doors of the service entrance swung open, and he saw an incredible sight. Anna and the same nurse who had been in the ward were pushing a stretcher on which his grandfather lay, still connected to a portable monitor and an IV. He didn't know how she had managed it. Perhaps her press card had worked its magic, perhaps it was money, or perhaps she had found an ally in the nurse, someone who was also tired of injustice. They quickly transferred Ivan to the car. "I have a cottage outside the city," said Anna, getting behind the wheel. "It's old and abandoned. No one will go there." The car took off a second before two policemen ran out into the backyard. They drove in complete silence, broken only by the beeping of the medical monitor. Alexei looked at his grandfather's emaciated face and felt a pang of guilt. He had rescued him from one prison only to drag him into a deadly race. Maybe he should have left everything as it was. But it was too late now. Anna's dacha was exactly as she had described it. An old wooden house surrounded by a dense garden. No one would look for them here. They carried Ivan into the house and laid him on the bed. He was unconscious, but breathing steadily. Anna found a doctor she knew who agreed to come privately and set up a new IV and bring medicine. The doctor, an elderly and cynical man, looked at Ivan and said only one sentence: "If he survives all this, I'll believe in God." There was a respite for several hours. Alexei, exhausted to the limit, sat by his grandfather's bed. Anna, never letting go of her laptop, searched the internet, comparing facts, names, and dates. By evening, Ivan regained consciousness. This time, his gaze was more meaningful. He looked at Alexei, then at Anna. He was silent. But then his hand slowly rose, and he pointed to his diary, which was lying on the table. "There. Not everything," he whispered so quietly that Alexei had to lean close to his lips. Krotov. He wasn't looking for valuables. He didn't care about the gold and diamonds they were hiding. Alexei froze. His whole theory was falling apart. If it wasn't contraband, then what was it? What could the cemetery guard have found that was worth 35 years of his life and now threatened him with death? Blueprints. Ivan exhaled. Under the crypt, there were old geological blueprints hidden of the entire area. Blueprints? Geological? Why would a party official need them in 1988? It didn't make any sense. Alexei looked at Anna, but she just shrugged. But at that moment, her eyes widened. She abruptly turned the laptop toward Alexei. An old article from the city newspaper's archive was open on the screen. She pointed to the headline. "Look, Petr Krotov's first major commercial project. Tsinasnardiki, or start of construction of the elite residential complex, Sosnovyy Bor." Alexei scanned the text and felt the ground slip away from under his feet. The last paragraph indicated the location of the future complex. It was being built on a huge site, right next to the old city cemetery. Alexei stared at the laptop screen, and the cold logic of an architect instantly pieced together the scattered pieces of the puzzle into a single, terrifying picture. Geological drawings, an elite complex built on the border of a cemetery, a murder that had to be covered up. None of this had anything to do with smuggling. It had to do with the foundation, with the land on which Krotov had built his empire. "Karst cavities," Alexei whispered, looking at Anna. Old cemeteries were often laid out on high ground, on dry soil. But if there's karst underneath, if there's karst, washable rock, he didn't finish. Anna understood without words. An entire elite neighborhood, Krotov's pride and joy, could be standing on thin air. In 1988, Ivan Sokolov, his grandfather, was restoring a crypt when he stumbled upon something more than just a basement. He found old, pre-revolutionary geological surveys that showed that the entire area was unstable. He found a death sentence for Krotov's future project. And Krotov, who apparently also knew about these maps, was ready to kill to keep this truth from ever coming to light. He wasn't just building houses. He was building a multi-story lie, and every brick in it was held together with fear and blood. The truth Alexei was looking for turned out to be scarier than any criminal showdown. It threatened not just prison for one person, but disaster for thousands. At that moment, Anna's phone rang. She looked at the screen and her face darkened. It was the doctor who had helped them. More precisely, his wife. Sobbing, the woman said that an hour ago, people had come to their home with a search warrant. The doctor had been taken away on charges of illegal drug trafficking. They had found ampules in his safe that he had never seen before in his life. Their only ally, their only hope for medical help, had been neutralized. And that was a signal to them. Krotov had shown that his arms were long enough to reach anyone who would help them. In an instant, they lost not just a doctor. They lost their last connection to the normal world. Now they were alone, completely alone. Alexei looked at his grandfather. Ivan lay with his eyes closed, breathing weakly. He was as fragile as an autumn leaf. The choice was simple, honor or life. To continue the fight meant almost certainly dooming the old man who had already been through hell. To retreat meant allowing the lies to win and making his grandfather's sacrifice meaningless. The weight of this choice fell on Alexei's shoulders like an unbearable burden. He approached the bed. "Grandfather," he said quietly, "where are those drawings? The diary is good, but without proof, your words are worthless. We need those maps." Ivan slowly opened his eyes. They were filled with terror. He shook his head, his lips whispering, "No, no, no." He began to panic. The monitor beeped alarmingly, showing how his pulse had jumped. Alexei realized that he had gone too far, that he was putting pressure on a man whose psyche was already stretched to the limit. He felt a pang of guilt. What was he doing? He was trying to extract a confession from a man who needed peace, but there was no other way. Anna came over and gently put her hand on Alexei's shoulder. "Quiet," she said. "You'll kill him." She sat down next to Ivan and began to speak to him in a soft, calm voice, as if he were a child. She talked about simple things. About the garden outside the window, about the smell of apples, and it worked. Ivan's breathing began to slow down. He stopped shaking, and then, staring at the ceiling, he whispered a few words that changed everything again. "Not in the crypt," he exhaled. "I hid it. In the well. The old well, behind the church. A well, another point on the cemetery map. It was crazy to go back to where they were already looking for them. But now they had a specific goal." Anna sat down at her laptop again. She typed the name of Krotov's residential complex and the word "incidents" into the search engine. Almost nothing. But on the third page of the search results, in the archive of a small construction forum from 2012, she found what she was looking for. A short message from an anonymous user. "Anyone know what's going on in Sosnovy Bor? There was a cordon off last night, like the ground had sunk near the 7th building. In the morning, they had already paved everything over, as if nothing had happened." This was the only message. But it was there. It was proof, a small crack in Krotov's monolithic wall of lies. Hope, fragile and weak, began to sprout in Alexei's soul, but it was immediately destroyed. "The car," Anna said suddenly, without looking up from the screen. "What?" Alexei didn't understand. "They tracked us by the car. Mine, I was at the hospital, then here. They could have put a tracker on it." The thought was so obvious and simple, that Alexei felt like an idiot. How could he, an architect who always thought everything through, not have thought of that? He ran out into the street. It was already getting dark. He knelt down and ran his hand under the wing of Anna's car. His fingers stumbled upon a small, cold plastic case attached to the metal with a magnet. A GPS tracker. They had been right under their noses the whole time. They had led the enemy to their hideout themselves. And at that very moment, the silence of the evening was broken by the crunch of gravel under the wheels of a heavy vehicle. Two black SUVs with no license plates came around the bend in the country road. Their headlights hit the windows of the cottage, turning it into a lit stage. They were trapped. There was nowhere to run. Alexei rushed into the house. "They're here," he shouted. Without saying a word, Anna rushed to the old wardrobe, took out a double-barreled shotgun, and loaded 2 cartridges with a clatter. It was her grandfather's weapon, which she had kept for just such an occasion. It seemed that occasion had arrived. Ivan curled up on the bed, his eyes wide with the same primal fear he had felt in 1988. History was repeating itself. The doors of the SUVs opened. 4 burly men led by Viktor Krotov got out. They slowly and deliberately headed toward the house. Fate was catching up with them with every step. "Don't come out, Sokolov. We just want to talk." Viktor Krotov's voice, amplified by a megaphone, sounded unnaturally loud in the evening silence. He was calm and businesslike, and this calmness sent a chill down Alexei's spine. It was the voice of a butcher coaxing a lamb to come closer. Anna, standing at the window with a double-barreled shotgun in her hands, only smiled crookedly. Her face was pale, but the hands holding the weapon did not tremble. She was not just a journalist looking for a scoop. Now it was her war. At that moment, she was the only thing standing between them and death. Alexei, paralyzed with fear, looked at her, then at his grandfather, who was cowering on the bed. The architect's brain, accustomed to calculations and logic, refused to work in this extreme situation. But then, through the panic, one thought broke through. The floor plan of the house. He had seen it when they arrived. An old cottage, there should be a cellar under the kitchen. Cold for storing vegetables. It was a chance. Small, slim, but a chance. "Anna, stall for time," he whispered. "As long as you can. I know what to do." She didn't turn around, just nodded briefly, her gaze fixed on the figures surrounding the house. Alexei rushed to the kitchen, an old wooden hatch in the floor, covered with faded linoleum. He pried it open with his knife with difficulty. The smell of damp earth and rot hit his face. He looked down. The stairs led to a cramped cellar, but that wasn't enough. They couldn't just sit there like rats in a trap. Then his gaze fell on a red gas cylinder standing next to the old stove. With trembling hands, he disconnected the hose. A plan, crazy and desperate, formed in his head in a split second. He would create a diversion that would give them a few minutes. But first, he had to get his grandfather down. That was the hardest part. He returned to the room. "Grandpa, we have to go." He tried to lift Ivan. "Get up, please, get up." But Ivan stared at him with empty eyes. His body, which had survived 35 years underground, refused to obey. The horror of the past had paralyzed his will. At that moment, a heavy boot struck the window frame, and glass scattered across the floor. "Last warning," Victor's voice boomed. Anna, without hesitation, raised her rifle and fired into the air. The sound of the shot made the attackers recoil. But it was only a brief respite. Alexei, in a rush of adrenaline, hoisted his grandfather onto his shoulders. He was as light as a child, incredibly light. He dragged him into the kitchen. After lowering Ivan into the cellar, he heard the front door creaking under the blows of a battering ram. There was no time. He returned to the kitchen, laid the gas cylinder on its side, pointed the valve toward the hallway, and turned the tap all the way. The gas began to escape with a loud hiss. Then he grabbed a box of matches from the table, lit several of them, and threw them onto an old oil-soaked rag at the entrance to the kitchen. The rag burst into flames. He had maybe 30 seconds. He jumped into the cellar and slammed the heavy hatch behind him. Down below, in complete darkness, he could hear only his own heartbeat and his grandfather's ragged breathing. It was at that moment, in that oppressive silence, that even Sokolov uttered the words that split Alexei's world into before and after. He grabbed his grandson's hand with his weak, bony palm and whispered, "I told Dima. I showed him the entrance to the crypt. I asked him to run away with me, to take him." He was scared. He chose to stay. He chose to forget. The man Alexei trusted more than anyone else in the world, his father, turned out to be not just an innocent child who didn't know the truth. He knew. He knew, and kept silent. For 35 years, he lived with this secret, allowing his father to rot alive underground. It wasn't just betrayal. It was a blow to the very heart of Alexei's personality, to the foundation of his world. There was a deafening explosion. The cellar hatch was thrown up and crashed back down with a crash. From above came the crackling of burning wood and screams. The house was on fire. Alexei, stunned, lost his bearings for a few seconds. But he had to act. In the far corner of the cellar, as he remembered from the plan, there was a narrow vent blocked with bricks. He rushed there, throwing away the stones. Behind it was an exit into the thick raspberry bushes behind the house. They made their way outside. The cottage was ablaze like a giant bonfire. The shadows of Krotov's men flitted in the light of the flames. They hadn't expected such resistance. They searched for them in the fire. Alexei, Anna, and Ivan crouched down and made their way through the overgrown garden toward the forest. They ran without looking where they were going, driven by fear and the light of the fire behind them. They had lost everything: their refuge, their car, their connection to the world. They had become fugitives, hunted animals. Stopping at the edge of the forest, they watched their last hope burn away. Ivan was breathing heavily, his condition rapidly deteriorating. Anna, her face black with soot, checked her rifle. She had one bullet left. Alexei stood and stared at the fire, but he didn't see it. He saw his father's face, and now he didn't know who he was: the son of a hero or the son of a coward. The world he had lived in turned out to be an illusion built on lies and fear. And in this new, terrifying reality, there was only one way forward: not to run away, but to return to the very beginning, to where it all began and where it was all supposed to end. He turned to Anna. His face was hard, with no trace of the indecisive architect he had once been. "They'll think we died in the fire, or that we ran out of the city," he said quietly but firmly. "But we won't run." He looked toward the distant lights of Verkhnekhamsk. "We'll go back to the cemetery. We'll go down into that well. We'll get those blueprints, even if it's the last thing we do in our lives." Night fell like a heavy, wet blanket. They made their way through the forest, trying to stay in the shadows of the trees, away from the roads. Every rustle made them jump. Ivan Sokolov, weakened by the shock he had experienced, could hardly walk. Alexei and Anna took turns dragging him along. Alexei no longer felt any pain in his muscles or fatigue. Everything inside him had burned out. leaving only a cold, crystalline core of rage. Rage at Krotov, at fate, and worst of all, at his own father. He no longer knew who he was. He was the grandson of a hero and the son of a traitor. The thought fluttered in his head like a trapped bird, giving him no peace. By morning, they had reached the outskirts of the city, but not the residential neighborhoods, but the industrial zone adjacent to the cemetery. Dirty fences, rusty garages, abandoned warehouses. It was a different world, the underside of respectable Verkhnekhamsk, which Petr Krotov loved to show off in glossy brochures. Anna used her old contacts to find them temporary shelter. It was an abandoned garage that had once belonged to a small-time gangster whom she had exposed in one of her articles. The owner had been in prison for a long time, and everyone had forgotten about the garage. It stank of gasoline and dampness, but at least there was a roof over their heads and an iron gate that could be locked from the inside. They laid Ivan on an old mattress. He fell into a stupor, his breathing barely audible. Anna examined him and shook her head. He needs a doctor, antibiotics. Without that, he won't last 2 days. He's coming down with pneumonia. The reality they were running from was catching up with them with every step. They could find any blueprints. But what was the point if the man for whom all this had been done was going to die in their arms? Alexei crouched in front of his grandfather, staring at his parchment-like face. He had to make a choice between revenge and salvation, between truth and life. But Ivan suddenly opened his eyes. He wasn't looking at Alexei, but somewhere through him. "The well," he whispered, his voice sounding like the rustling of sand. "It's different. Not like the others." He began to describe it. It was not an ordinary wooden hut. It was a technical well for servicing the drainage system, built together with the church in the 19th century. The cover was not wooden, but cast iron, heavy, with a monogram. And the entrance to it was not visible, but hidden under the turf near the north wall of the old bell tower. He said that when he hid the tube with the drawings there, he deliberately knocked down part of the brickwork to block the passage, leaving only a small gap. Only one person could squeeze through. Alexei listened, and a new plan was already forming in his head. He would not choose between revenge and salvation. He would do both. "Anna," he said, turning to her, "I need you to do one thing, the loudest thing in your life." He began to speak quickly, his eyes burning with feverish intensity. He wasn't just asking her to write an article. He was asking her to create an information explosion. To gather everything they had, Ivan's story, the anonymous message from the forum, information about the missing doctor, the story of the fire, and throw it all online, all at once, through every possible channel. Create a wave that Krotov couldn't stop. Let them search the whole city. Let them block all the exits. We need them to be distracted just for 1 hour. Anna looked at him, and her eyes were filled with admiration. This was no longer the confused architect she had met at the hospital. This was a strategist. "And you?" she asked. "I'll go to the cemetery," Alexei replied. "I'll get those blueprints." It was suicide, and they both knew it. The cemetery was probably swarming with Krotov's men right now. But that was the plan. They would look for a group of 3 people. They would wait for them at the crypt. But they wouldn't be waiting for one person who would come from the other side and climb into an old, abandoned well. At night, while Anna was connected to Wi-Fi at the nearest 24-hour store, preparing her information bomb, Alexei was getting ready for his sortie. He found a roll of rope, some scrap metal, and an old miner's lamp in the garage. He put on dark clothes. Before leaving, he went to his grandfather. Ivan was awake. He looked at his grandson, and there was no fear in his eyes anymore. There was hope. Your father, Ivan said quietly. He wasn't evil. He was weak, and fear makes weak people cruel, not to others, to themselves. These words pierced Alexei. He understood that his grandfather had forgiven his son, and perhaps someday he would be able to forgive him too. Alexei made his way through the night city like a shadow. He moved through back alleys and courtyards, avoiding the lit streets. He felt like the hero of a thriller, only it was all real. When he reached the cemetery wall, he waited for the signal. At 3 o'clock in the morning, his phone vibrated briefly. It was a signal from Anna. The bomb had exploded. He climbed over the wall. The cemetery was quiet. Too quiet. He expected to see people, to hear voices, but there was nothing. This silence was more sinister than any ambush. He reached the old church, the bell tower. He found the place his grandfather had described. He lifted a layer of turf. Underneath was a round cast-iron cover. He pried it open with a crowbar. It gave way with a deafening screech. He froze, listening. Silence. He turned on his flashlight and shone it down. A narrow well, with walls made of old bricks. About 5 meters below, he could see the rubble his grandfather had mentioned. He tied a rope around a tree and began to climb down. At the bottom, he found a crack. It was very narrow. He had to exhale all the air in his lungs to squeeze through. He found himself in a small side tunnel, and there, in a niche, he saw it. An old leather tube covered with a layer of mold. He took it out. His hands were shaking. Inside was a roll of thick, yellowed paper. Blueprints. He had found them. He had won. But as he began to climb back out, the beam of his flashlight caught something in the darkness that made him freeze. On the brick wall, next to the crack he had crawled through, was a message scratched into the brick. It was fresh. It had been made with a nail or a knife. The inscription read, "We knew you would come, but not for this." Alexei didn't understand. What did it mean? He shone his flashlight around and saw a second tube, exactly the same, but new and clean. It lay a little further away, in the shadows. He opened it. Inside was not a drawing. There was a sheet of paper folded in 4, and a GPS tracker, exactly the same as the one on Anna's car. He unfolded the sheet. There were only 3 words printed on it. "Look at your grandfather." And at that moment, his phone vibrated again. There was a video on the screen. It was a live stream. He saw the garage. He saw Anna, tied up with a gag in her mouth, and he saw Viktor Krodov holding a syringe to his grandfather's vein. It was a trap, a perfect, monstrous trap. The blueprints were bait. They had been the real target all along, all 3 of them. If you had a choice, what would you do in Alexei's place? Publish the real blueprints, risking the lives of your grandfather and Anna, but exposing Krotov, or hand them over in exchange for their safety, allowing the criminal to get away?